Lesson 5.2 is on what can trigger genetic disease. So from the first lesson, we talked about genetic disorders and diseases. This lesson, we're going to look into the trigger or the cause of all these genetic diseases and possible preventions. So here are the objectives. Hopefully you guys already wrote them down. You can pause the video and write the objectives, or if you're printing out, just underline some of the key facts, and then you can go back into these questions afterwards after we're done with our lesson to see if you understand all the objective questions that we're trying to cover here. Before we start the lesson, I'm just going to define what a disease is. If you recall, a disorder, a genetic disorder, is a health problem caused by a defect in one or more genes or chromosomes. For any disease that you see, they may not be from genetic factors, but it's an abnormal condition that affects the body. So it doesn't have to be caused by a genetic factor, but it can be any abnormal condition that you may have for your body. Basically, if you're not healthy, you're having some sort of abnormal condition that affects your body, so we can call that a disease. It can be caused by an infection, caused by different types of pathogens like bacteria, protists, viruses, and things like that, or it could be caused by mutated genes. We're not talking about disorders that you're going to see that the person would have. It's going to be more from the genetic factors that can cause the person to have certain types of diseases. As you can see, our first one has a title of multifactorial diseases. Multi meaning many, and then factorial would be factors. So basically, the diseases that we're going to look into are happening because of many different factors and reasons that we may or may not know. So like I said, result when several factors cause a disease, but we do have two main factors that would affect the person to have multifactorial diseases. The first one is going to be a genetic factor, which can be having a family history of having certain types of diseases. And then the second one is going to be an environmental factor. Basically, where you live, how you live your life, and so forth would be an environmental factor. So let's look at the first factor, genetic factor. Usually genetic health risks happens because of more than one gene. And thus you have the name for multifactorial diseases. It's not going to be a single gene disorder. You're going to have maybe several different genes that are affecting you. And they're not necessarily passed from the parents. You can have different genes passed from your parents, but then also you may have different genetic factors either from your ancestors, or you may have developed something when you're having your cell division. So it can be completely up to you. However, certain genetic components can cause the disease to occur more likely. So even though you don't have the disease, certain genetic components may increase the chance of you getting certain type of diseases. Continuing from the previous slides, even though you may have a certain genetic component that may expose you to have higher risk of getting different type of diseases, it is difficult to determine a person's risk based on their family members and their medical history. So your mom or dad having a certain type of disease does not mean you're going to have that disease for sure, certainly. You may have a higher risk because of different genetic components. On the bottom of this slide, I have a chart that explains the degrees of relationship and the percentage of the genes that you share with those relatives, so that we can see how you may or may not have certain risks based on your family members. So let's say the first degree is going to share 50% of your genes in common. For example, your parents with you, or you and your siblings. So the reason why is because you are going to receive half of your genes from your mom and half of your genes from your dad. So obviously, if you are a child, you're going to share half of your genes with one of your parents and the other half with your remaining parent. Same thing with siblings. So you are going to have 50% of genes that are in common. So chances are you may or may not receive that certain genetic component that your mom or dad may have. If you go to second degree, which will share 25% of the genes, and that's 1/4, it's already half less than what you shared. It's going to be between aunt and uncle and their nieces and nephews. So with your uncle or aunt, if you have one, you're sharing 25% because, again, your aunt or uncle will be sharing 50% of their genes with your parent, and thus you are going to only share 1/4 of those genes. With your first cousin, so your uncle or aunt's kids, you're going to share about 12.5% of your genes, and that's not a great percentage if you really think about it. That's 1/8 of their genes. So as you go down to this list in different degrees, you're less likely to share certain type of disease. So just because your cousin has a genetic disease doesn't mean that you're going to have a high chance of getting the same genetic disease, because you only have 1/8 of the genes in common. So this slide is actually on the environmental factors that we have. I don't have the bullet point here, but you can always add a bullet point or just indicate that this is the environmental cause. And for those who are writing the notes, I know it looks like a lot of writing, but just put in the essential part of it. Okay, so we have different hazards such as air pollution, arsenic, lead, mercury, and pesticides. These are the more common environmental contaminants that may affect people in a negative way. Air pollutants such as burning different fossil fuels or industries waste can cause people to have asthma or any respiratory related diseases. And if you compare the health of a person who lives in the city versus someone out in the countryside, you're going to see that health effect clearly because of the air quality. Arsenic is a poisonous chemical that different industries or mining companies may use, also in the farms, as part of different chemicals to treat things. And if they go underwater and start affecting people who are drinking or eating certain things from the soil or water, people may have skin problems, rashes, cancer, or even death. Lead poisoning is not going to be as common nowadays, but if you are living in homes that were built before 1978 and you have not repainted the house, you have a higher risk of lead poisoning because paint before 1978 included lead as one of their ingredients. Also, industrial waste and some of the other imported goods may still contain lead, and usually in different products they have to let you know that this may contain lead, so consumers can make their own choices depending on the information. The main problem of lead poisoning is for the babies and for pregnant women, because it may result in severe learning problems and slow growth for babies. Mercury is another chemical that are often used for different industries and power plants. We don't use mercury anymore for our thermometers, so the chances of us having contamination through science equipment is very slim. When you are contaminated, though, you can have a range of different health problems, including cerebral palsy or learning disorders. I think the last one will be actually more affecting than any other things that we have looked into. Pesticides. Because we are eating different food produces that are going to be raised with different types of pesticides, eating unwashed food can increase the risk of having these harmful chemical exposure. You may have different symptoms such as headache, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, cancer, and some even say for Parkinson's disease. If you happen to have exposure to pesticides in a larger dosage, you have to make sure you look for medical help, because your symptoms can be very severe or it may even cost your life. For number 2, we're going to look into cardiovascular disease. The name cardiovascular is with two different parts. Cardio, which means heart, vascular means vessels. So it's going to be the disease that affects the heart and the blood vessels. Cardiovascular disease is actually the leading disease in the US, and it involves either a structural or functional abnormality of the cardiovascular system. So it can be either heart or your blood vessels. The cause of these disease would be both genetic and environmental, which means you'll have genetic components or tendency to develop certain condition, and you'll have environmental factors such as what you eat, how you exercise, where you live, and things like that. Your inherited trait can be activated or made worse by the environmental factors. So for some people, even though they may have genetic factors, it may not activate if they're taking care of their bodies. However, if you're making choices that are not really good for your actual genetically existing condition, it can either escalate or make things worse for your health condition. So it may not be activated if you take a good care of your body, but oftentimes people have this disease because they are not so good at taking care of their bodies. One of the more prominent cardiovascular diseases is called atherosclerosis. So this condition happens when you have high level of cholesterol buildup in your body. Cholesterol, you may have heard it before, is a waxy substance that stays in your blood. If you have good cholesterol, it helps you. If you have bad cholesterol, it's actually going to make your life a little harder. If you have too much of them, they start building plaques inside of the walls of the arteries, which results in narrower passage for your blood to flow. Think about drinking smoothie with coffee straw, which are very narrow and flat. You're not going to be able to drink your smoothie well because your spaces are limited. So what you're going to do is you're going to put more pressure so that you can have those smoothie come out of the straw. And that's exactly what's going to happen when you have clogged arteries. So you're going to have high blood pressure because your heart is trying to pump out blood to make sure that your blood is going through the arteries. Now, when you're putting too much pressure into your arteries, they may get overworked and they may get overly stretched out. And if they're too stretched out, they're not going to work properly to move the blood efficiently. So think about hair ties. If you have hair ties that you use it over and over and over, eventually the rubber band part is going to stretch out and it may not be as elastic as the new one. So the same thing, arteries are going to be used up and you're going to have too much pressure onto it, so they're going to lose that elastic characteristics, which help them to be more efficient in delivering blood all over your body. Now we were talking about multifactorial diseases, so we have two different factors that we're going to look into. The first one, the genetic facts. Genetic trait will have some tendency to develop high cholesterol level or high blood pressure. So you can have the tendency. Actually, 1 in 500 people will have a tendency to develop high cholesterol level. Doesn't mean that everyone will develop high cholesterol, but it's pretty common. But then when you have these environmental triggers, such as poor eating habits or poor exercise habits, now you may trigger those genetic tendencies to actually develop something that's more severe and can develop into different diseases like cardiovascular disease.